Your love and sweet comments truly motivate me. It's because of you that I can bring more and more stories to life. It was Christmas Eve, and I'd agreed to house sit for my boss. The house was a cozy 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood in Hamilton, Ontario. It was the kind of street where every window glowed with Christmas lights and snow blanketed the yards like a holiday postcard. My boss was away visiting family, leaving me to watch their golden retriever, Max. Easy money, I thought. The night had been uneventful. I was curled up on the couch, sipping cocoa while Max snored on the rug in front of the Christmas tree. The only sounds were the faint hum of the furnace and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet. Then, I heard it. At first, it was faint, a metallic click coming from the direction of the kitchen. I paused, the mug halfway to my lips, and glanced toward the doorway. Nothing seemed out of place. Max's ears perked up, but he didn't stir. I told myself it was probably just the old pipes or the wind rattling the porch. But a minute later, there it was again. Louder this time, like someone jiggling the back door handle. Max lifted his head, letting out a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I set the mug down and stood up, trying to shake the unease. Probably just the wind, I muttered, more to reassure myself than anything else. But Max's growl deepened, his body tense as he stared toward the kitchen. Heart thudding, I moved cautiously toward the back of the house. The kitchen was dimly lit, the glow from the tree barely reaching the corners. My eyes darted to the glass panel on the back door, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing outside, his face partially hidden by the shadow of the porch light. He was fiddling with the lock, his movements quick and deliberate. He wasn't wearing gloves, and his breath fogged the glass as he worked. My stomach dropped. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What are you doing?" The man froze, his head snapping up. For a moment, he just stared at me through the glass. Then, he stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. I thought he might leave, but instead he moved closer, leaning forward until his face was inches from the glass. His eyes locked on mine, cold and unflinching. Max barked, a deep, ferocious sound that startled even me. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand and tapped the glass with one finger. Slow, deliberate taps that made my skin crawl. I backed away, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, keeping my eyes on the door. "There's someone trying to break into the house," I whispered to the dispatcher. "He's at the back door." Before I could finish, the sound of shattering glass cut through the air. The man had smashed the lower panel of the door and was reaching through to unlock it. Max lunged, barking furiously, his paws scraping against the tile as he tried to get at the intruder. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said, her voice calm but firm. "Officers are on their way." I grabbed Max by the collar and dragged him back into the hallway, slamming the kitchen door shut behind us. My hands shook as I locked it, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard the creak of the back door swinging open, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps on the tile. He was inside. I retreated to the living room, grabbing the fireplace poker as I tried to steady my nerves. Max was by my side, growling low and steady. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the living room. My grip on the poker tightened as the man stepped into view. He was tall, his face partially obscured by a knit hat pulled low over his brow. In his hand, he held a crowbar, the metal catching the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. For a moment, neither of us moved. His eyes scanned the room, landing on me. He didn't look angry or panicked. He looked calm. Too calm. "The cops are coming," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "If you leave now, they won't catch you." He tilted his head as if considering my words. Then, a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. "You're right," he said. "I'd better be quick." Before I could react, the sound of sirens pierced the air, faint but growing louder. His smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of frustration. Without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the hallway. Moments later, I heard the back door slam shut. I stayed frozen until the police arrived, Max pressed against my side, his body still tense. They found footprints leading away from the house, but no sign of the man. The officers reassured me they'd patrol the area, but their tone told me they didn't expect to find him. Last Christmas, I decided to do something different. Instead of the usual family gathering in Calgary, I rented a small cabin in the woods near Revelstoke, British Columbia. I wanted some peace and quiet, a chance to escape the holiday chaos and spend a few days alone with my thoughts. The cabin was perfect. Nestled deep in the pines, it was rustic but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and big windows that overlooked the snowy forest. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It felt like I'd stepped into a postcard. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I read, cooked simple meals, and watched the snow fall outside. The solitude was refreshing, almost meditative. But by Christmas Eve, the isolation started to feel different. Not bad, exactly, just heavier. The silence that had been so comforting now seemed oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, I was sitting by the fire, writing in a journal I'd brought with me, when I noticed something strange. Across the room, one of the curtains had shifted slightly, as if it had been disturbed. I stared at it, waiting to see if it moved again, but it didn't. I told myself it was probably just the draft from the chimney. Still, I got up to check. When I pulled the curtain aside, I saw nothing but darkness outside. The porch light barely illuminated the snow, and beyond that, the woods were pitch black. I let the curtain fall back into place, but the unease lingered. I tried to shake it off. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. Who or what could possibly be out there? I locked the doors, checked the windows, and went to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, the fire reduced to faint embers in the stove. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound like footsteps in the snow. I froze, listening. The sound was faint but deliberate, moving slowly around the cabin. My first thought was that it might be a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm of the steps was too steady, too deliberate. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were walking. My heart started to race as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped briefly, then started again, this time closer to the porch. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was miles from the nearest town. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and crept toward the living room. The cabin had a shotgun mounted above the fireplace, a relic from the previous owner. I'd seen it when I first arrived and thought it was just for decoration, but now I was grateful it was there. My hands shook as I pulled it down. It was heavier than I expected. The footsteps stopped again, this time right outside the front door. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for the sound to start again. But instead, I heard something else. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it sounded like thunder. My grip tightened on the shotgun as I moved closer to the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone in trouble, but why wouldn't they call out? "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" No answer, just the sound of the wind howling through the trees. I stood there, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to move closer to the window. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out, and what I saw made my blood turn cold. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the porch, but they didn't stop there. They continued past the door and around the side of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. Whoever had knocked wasn't waiting. They were circling the cabin. I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I heard the back door creak. The cabin only had 2 entrances, and I was certain I'd locked both. But that sound, the faint groan of the hinges, was unmistakable. I turned, aiming the shotgun toward the hallway that led to the kitchen and the back door. The firelight cast long shadows, but everything else was still. I took a step forward, then another, every instinct screaming at me to leave. And then, I saw it. The back door was open just a crack, snow blowing in across the floor. I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I stood frozen, listening for any sound, any hint of movement. But the cabin was silent again, as if the intruder had melted back into the night. I didn't wait to find out who, or what, it was. I grabbed my coat, threw on my boots, and bolted out the front door. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I followed the trail back to my car, slipping and stumbling in the snow. When I finally reached it, I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped down the narrow road, my tires skidding on the ice. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Revelstoke. I checked into the first motel I found and stayed there until morning. The next day, I called the cabin's owner to tell them what had happened. They were as confused as I was and promised to check it out. A few days later, they called me back. "There's nothing missing," they said, "but we did find something strange. On the back door there were scratch marks, deep ones like someone was trying to pry it open." I haven't been back to that cabin or anywhere else in the woods since. And every Christmas Eve I think about those knocks on the door and the footsteps in the snow, and I wonder, was it someone looking for help? Or was it something else entirely? It was Christmas Eve, and I was working a late shift at the small bed and breakfast my family runs in the Lake District, up in northern England. The place is quiet in winter, nestled on the edge of a village just outside Ambleside. We don't usually get guests this time of year, but my parents had gone to visit my grandparents, leaving me in charge. I'd been expecting an empty night. The snowstorm rolling through made it unlikely anyone would turn up, so I spent most of the evening reading in the sitting room by the fire. Around 9 p.m., just as I was thinking about locking up and heading to bed, I heard the doorbell. It startled me. I wasn't used to late-night visitors, and the storm outside made the timing even stranger. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat that looked far too thin for the weather. His hair was damp from the snow, and he carried a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and polite. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you so late, but I got caught in the storm. Is there any chance you've got a room for the night?" He looked harmless enough, though something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't quite match his friendly smile, or how he stood just outside the glow of the porch light, as though he didn't want me to see him clearly. Still, I couldn't turn him away. It was Christmas after all. I forced a smile and stepped aside. "Of course, come in and warm up." The man nodded, thanking me as he stepped inside. I led him to the reception desk, taking his details while he rubbed his hands together to shake off the cold. His name was Martin, and he said he'd been hiking in the area when the storm caught him off guard. It seemed plausible enough. Plenty of walkers came through the region, even in winter. After checking him in, I showed him to one of the guest rooms upstairs. "Breakfast is at 8, I said, handing him the key. He smiled, thanked me again, and closed the door. That should have been the end of it. But something about the encounter left me uneasy. The way he'd avoided eye contact when I asked about his plans, the way his bag looked almost empty, as though he hadn't packed for a hike at all. I told myself I was overthinking things. The storm outside was making the whole night feel eerie. I went back to the sitting room, but I couldn't relax. Every creak of the old house seemed louder than usual, and I kept glancing toward the staircase, half expecting Martin to come back down. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I locked up, double-checking the doors and windows, and headed to my room. I woke up sometime after 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, moving toward the stairs. I sat up, my pulse quickening. It wasn't unusual for guests to wander downstairs, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt wrong, too heavy, too intentional. I got out of bed and opened my door just a crack. The hallway was dark, but I could see a figure moving toward the staircase. It was Martin. He was holding something in his hand, a small flashlight, its dim beam sweeping over the walls as he descended. I stepped into the hall, keeping my distance. "Martin?" I called softly. "Is everything all right?" He froze, the beam of his flashlight jerking slightly. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, without turning around, he said, "Just grabbing some water." His voice was calm, but it didn't match his body language. He was tense, his shoulders hunched as though he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. I watched as he disappeared down the stairs, the creak of the steps fading into silence. Something didn't sit right. I waited a few minutes before following, moving as quietly as I could. When I reached the ground floor, I saw the light from his flashlight flickering in the dining room. I crept closer, peeking around the corner. He wasn't getting water. He was standing by the sideboard, going through the drawers. His movements were quick, almost frantic, as though he was searching for something specific. My stomach twisted. "Martin," I said louder this time. He whipped around, his flashlight beam catching me in the face. He stammered, shoving the drawer shut. "I was just looking for a pen. To leave a note." The lie was obvious, but I didn't know what to do. My family always taught me to be polite, even in awkward situations, so I nodded, forcing a smile. "The pens are in the reception desk drawer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," he said, his smile thin and unconvincing. He brushed past me, heading toward the stairs. I stayed in the dining room until I heard his door close upstairs. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in the sitting room, the fireplace poker clutched in my hand, my eyes fixed on the staircase. The storm outside had quieted, but the tension in the house was unbearable. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering what he'd been looking for and why he'd lied. By morning, Martin was gone. His room was empty, the bed neatly made, the key left on the nightstand. But when I checked the sideboard in the dining room, I found the bottom drawer half open. Inside was an envelope addressed to my parents, containing some petty cash and spare keys for the B&B. Both were missing. I called the local police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I never heard back. To this day, I don't know who Martin really was or what else he might have been planning. But every Christmas Eve since, I've made sure we never leave the B&B unattended. It was late afternoon on Christmas Eve, and the city was alive with last-minute shoppers rushing through the crowded streets. I was walking home from work, arms loaded with small bags of gifts I'd picked up during my lunch break. The air was crisp, and the lights strung across the storefronts gave the street a festive glow. Despite the holiday cheer, something about the day felt off, a gnawing unease I couldn't quite place. I live in a modest apartment on the edge of the city, where the bustling streets give way to quieter residential blocks. As I turned the corner onto my street, I noticed a man standing by a lamppost about halfway down the block. He was dressed in an old, oversized coat, his head down, and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. At first I thought he was just another passerby, but as I approached, I realized he wasn't moving. His presence unsettled me. He stood perfectly still, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, and I could feel his eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. I clutched my bags tighter and quickened my pace, my apartment building now only a few steps away. As I reached my building's front door, I glanced back. The man was still there, standing under the lamppost, but now he was facing me directly. The light from the lamppost illuminated his face just enough for me to make out his features. Sharp cheekbones, a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a gaze that felt uncomfortably fixed on me. I fumbled with my keys, pushing open the door and stepping into the relative safety of the lobby. The door clicked shut behind me, but the unease lingered. I made my way up to my apartment on the second floor, dropped my bags on the couch, and locked the door behind me. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, and I couldn't resist the urge to peek out of my window. My apartment faced the street, and from my vantage point, I could see the lamppost clearly. The man was gone. Relieved, I tried to shake off the tension, convincing myself that it had been nothing more than a random encounter. I turned on the TV, poured myself a glass of wine, and started wrapping the gifts I'd bought. The festive music playing in the background helped calm my nerves, and for a while, I forgot about the man on the street. That peace shattered when I heard a knock at my door, It wasn't loud or insistent, just a soft, deliberate knock, 3 evenly spaced raps. My stomach tightened as I set down the wrapping paper and stood, staring at the door. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. Another knock followed, just as soft and deliberate as the first. I moved slowly toward the door, checking the peephole. My heart sank. It was him. He stood there, hat pulled low over his face, his coat slightly open to reveal a dark sweater underneath. His hands were still in his pockets, and he wasn't moving. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. How had he found me? Why was he here? The knocks came again, louder this time. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The call wouldn't connect. I glanced at the signal bar. No service. My building's old wiring often interfered with reception, but tonight it felt like a cruel joke. I decided to ignore him, hoping he would leave. Minutes passed, and the knocking stopped. The silence was almost worse. I crept back to the peephole. The hallway was empty. I let out a shaky breath and stepped away from the door. But as I turned, I froze. A shadow moved outside my window. My apartment was on the second floor, but there he was, standing on the fire escape, his face pressed against the glass. Panic surged through me. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find, and backed into the corner of the room. The man didn't try to open the window. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass, his breath fogging the pain. Then slowly he raised a hand and pointed at me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and climbed down the fire escape, disappearing into the night. I stayed in the kitchen for what felt like hours, clutching the knife and listening for any sign of him returning. But the night remained silent. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the city was bathed in pale sunlight. I checked the fire escape, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. No footprints, no smudges on the window, nothing. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I moved out of that apartment a week later. Even now, years later, I can't walk down a quiet street without glancing over my shoulder, searching for a shadow under a lamppost or a face in a window. Christmas has never felt the same since. It was Christmas Eve, and I had just settled into my chair with a glass of whiskey, enjoying the quiet of my small home in Ellsworth, Maine. It had been a long year, and I wasn't much in the mood for celebrating. My separation had been finalized a few months ago, and the house felt emptier than ever. My ex-partner, Yara, had taken our daughter, Elise, to visit her parents for the holidays, leaving me alone with the flickering lights of the tree and a silence that felt heavier than it should. The sound of the doorbell shattered the quiet. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 10 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't seen a single car drive down our snowy street all evening. I hesitated for a moment before standing and walking to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch, his figure barely visible under the dim light of the street lamp. He was wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap pulled low over his face. Something about the way he stood, his shoulders stiff, his hands buried deep in his pockets, made me uneasy. "Can I help you?" I called through the door. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice muffled by the door. "My car broke down a little ways back and my phone's dead. I was hoping to use yours to call a tow truck." I didn't answer immediately. The situation seemed plausible enough, but there was something about his tone that felt off. It wasn't desperate or frantic, as I'd expect from someone stranded in the cold. It was too measured, too calm. "Where's your car?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Just up the road," he replied. "I can't get it to start, and I've been walking for a while now." I glanced back at the living room, where my phone was sitting on the coffee table. Every instinct in me screamed to keep the door shut, but the faint voice of reason nudged at my conscience. What if he really was in trouble? What if he froze out there because I didn't help? "Hang on," I said, grabbing my phone. I unlocked it and dialed a tow company, keeping one eye on the door as I waited for someone to pick up. "Hi," I said when the line connected. "There's a man here who says his car broke down. Can you send someone out to Stone Ridge Lane?" Stone Ridge Lane? The dispatcher repeated, their voice tinged with confusion. We haven't had any calls from that area tonight. Are you sure he's stranded? The question made my stomach tighten. I glanced back at the peephole, but the man was gone. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly opened the app for my home security cameras. The feed from the porch camera showed nothing but falling snow and an empty street. I locked the door and walked to the front window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The street was deserted, the snow undisturbed except for a set of footprints leading from my driveway to the porch. They ended there, with no sign of a car or where the man had gone. My phone buzzed in my hand, startling me. It was the dispatcher calling back. I answered quickly. Sir, we traced your location, they said, their tone urgent. If you're not expecting anyone, you should lock your doors. There's been a string of break-ins in your area over the last week. The suspects have been posing as stranded motorists. The words sent a chill through me. I thanked the dispatcher and hung up, my mind racing. My hands shook as I double-checked the locks on every door and window in the house. The quiet that had once felt comforting now pressed down on me like a weight. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I'd scared him off by calling for help. It was Christmas Eve, and the diner was nearly empty. Just me, a couple in a corner booth, and the waitress wiping down the counter. I'd stopped off the highway for a quick bite, planning to get back on the road to make it home to Larkspur before midnight. The storm outside had other plans. Snow was coming down in thick sheets, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The place had that quiet hum of emptiness. The jukebox in the corner played some old country tune. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, and the coffee in my cup had long gone cold. I was staring out the window, watching the snow pile up, when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped in, stomping snow from his boots. He was tall, with a wiry frame and a face that looked like it had seen better days. His coat was threadbare, and his scarf hung loose around his neck. He glanced around the diner, his eyes landing on me briefly before moving to the waitress. "Storm's getting bad out there," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet. The waitress nodded, her polite smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." He slid into the booth across from mine, tossing his scarf onto the table. He didn't look at me again, but I couldn't help stealing glances at him. Something about him put me on edge. Maybe it was the way he moved, deliberate and slow, like he was sizing up the room. The waitress brought his coffee, and he thanked her quietly before pulling out a small notebook. He flipped through it, pausing every so often to scribble something down. I tried not to stare, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Traveling far?" I asked, my voice breaking the uneasy silence. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were sharp, almost predatory. "Far enough," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. I nodded, regretting the question. The jukebox fell silent, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The couple in the corner finished their meal and left, leaving me alone with the man and the waitress. The tension in the room felt heavier now, like the storm had seeped inside. "You heading somewhere for Christmas?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Yeah," I said. "Home." "Must be nice," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Family waiting for you?" I hesitated, unsure why the question unsettled me. "Yeah, my sister." He nodded, but his smile didn't fade. "Not everyone's that lucky." The waitress came by, refilling my coffee without a word. I glanced at her, hoping to catch some reassurance in her expression, but she looked as uneasy as I felt. The man's notebook lay open on the table, and I caught a glimpse of what he was writing. Names, dozens of them, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. My stomach tightened. "What's the notebook for?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He closed it slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Work," he said. "Keeps me organized." The waitress disappeared into the back, leaving us alone in the diner. The man leaned back in his booth, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "You should probably wait out the storm," he said, his voice low. "Wouldn't want to get stuck out there. Dangerous roads." "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I've driven through worse." He chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Sure you have." The door to the kitchen swung open, and the waitress reappeared, her face pale. She avoided looking at the man as she set a check on his table. "Whenever you're ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't move. He just stared at me, his smile fading. "You know," he said slowly, "this time of year, people think they're safe, surrounded by family, gifts, all that cheer. But out here, it's just you and the road." I didn't respond. My hand tightened around my coffee cup, the ceramic warm against my palm. He stood abruptly, pulling a few bills from his pocket and dropping them on the table. "Merry Christmas," he said, tipping his hat before walking out into the storm. The bell jingled as the door shut behind him, and the room felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and looked at the waitress. She was staring at the door, her hands gripping the counter tightly. "Do you know him?" I asked. She shook her head. But he comes through here every year, always around Christmas, always leaves a name behind." I frowned. "A name?" She nodded, motioning toward his table. I walked over and picked up the receipt he'd left. Scrawled at the bottom, just below the total, was a single name. Mine. I didn't wait to ask questions. I grabbed my coat and bolted for the door, the snow stinging my face as I ran to my car. As I pulled out onto the highway, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his figure in the distance.